In the previous video, we covered the basics of classical conditioning. In this video, we now turn our attention to a second mechanism by which learning can occur, operant conditioning. Whereas classical conditioning is about pairing two stimuli in the environment, operant conditioning is about pairing voluntary behaviors with outcomes, either a punishment or a reward. The basic principle underlying operant conditioning is based on Thorndike's law of effect, which states that behaviors that have a satisfying outcome are more likely to be repeated, whereas behaviors that have an unsatisfying outcome are less likely to be repeated. In other words, if you do a particular behavior and there's a positive consequence, you're probably going to be more likely to want to do that behavior again. And by comparison, if you do something and there's a negative consequence, you're probably not going to want to do that behavior again. Building on Thorndike's work, B.F. Skinner more fully developed these theories and gave us a useful terminology to talk about things that have either satisfying or unsatisfying outcomes. Specifically, in Skinner's terminology, a reinforcement is anything that has an ultimately satisfying outcome. Receiving a reinforcement for performing a particular behavior should therefore make that behavior more likely to be repeated in the future. For example, if you reward a young child for saying please by giving her the object that she asked for, then you are reinforcing that behavior and making it more likely she'll continue to say please in the future. In contrast, a punishment is anything that has an ultimately unsatisfying outcome. Being punished for a particular behavior should make that behavior less likely to be repeated in the future. For example, I have a cat named Clover who's adorable and very sweet and very smart. Unfortunately, she also has a bit of a bad habit of jumping up on our kitchen countertops, which we'd like her not to do. I have a spray bottle that can spray water, and this doesn't hurt Clover at all, but it's mildly unpleasant. She doesn't really enjoy that. So in theory, if I spray Clover whenever she gets on the kitchen counter, this should make it less likely that she'll keep doing that behavior in the future. Skinner also distinguished between positive versus negative forms of punishments and reinforcements. Here, though, positive and negative do not mean good or bad. Rather, positive here simply means that something was added, whereas negative means that something was taken away. So when you hear the terms positive and negative reinforcement, think more in terms of addition and subtraction rather than good versus bad. A positive reinforcement is when something good is added. For example, getting paid, getting your favorite candy bar, or receiving a smile from a friend would all be examples of positive reinforcers. Now we come to the psychology term that is perhaps one of the most misused in everyday language, negative reinforcement. It does not mean punishment. Remember, a reinforcer means that the organism receives an ultimately good outcome. Rather, the negative here simply means that something was taken away. In this case, because the outcome is ultimately a satisfying one, negative reinforcement means that something aversive was removed. Returning to another example with my cat. After a couple of days, her litter box gets a little bit stinky, which causes me to then empty it. This is an example of negative reinforcement. I clean the litter box, the behavior, and I receive a satisfying outcome for it. The stinky smell is taken away. And that makes it more likely that I'll continue to do that behavior again in the future. As another example of negative reinforcement from my own life, my mom worries every year about me getting my flu shot. She got the flu one time and apparently it was really horrible, and like a good mom, she never wants me to have to experience that. So every year, starting around October, she starts bugging me to get my flu shot. It seems that nearly every time we talk on the phone, she asks me if I've gotten it yet. To stop my mom's nagging, I usually do in fact get my flu shot every year. Again, in this instance, the behavior, getting a flu shot, is being reinforced or being made more likely to be repeated, because when I do so, there's an aversive stimulus, my mom's constant bugging, that's taken away. Negative reinforcement may be a little tricky to get the hang of at first because it does start with something aversive that's present at the beginning. However, the key is that the aversive stimulus is eventually removed, which ultimately serves to reward or reinforce a particular behavior. There are also positive and negative forms of punishment. Positive punishment means that something bad is added. The example that I mentioned earlier about using a water spray bottle with my cat is an example of positive punishment. Getting a spanking or getting yelled at would be other forms of positive punishment. Negative punishment, in contrast, is when something good is taken away. Losing any form of privilege, like having your car keys taken away, losing out on TV time, or being put in timeout, etc., would all be forms of negative punishment. When reinforcing a desired behavior, we can also think about how often a reward is given. This is the idea behind schedules of reinforcement. Often, when we want to reward or reinforce a particular behavior over time, we don't just reward it once and then stop. Rather, we continue to reinforce that behavior again and again. In some cases, we might want to reinforce a desired behavior every single time that it's performed. This is called a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Continuous schedules of reinforcement are helpful when initially training a new desired behavior. For example, if you have a dog and you've ever taught him to do a particular trick, like sit or shake, you probably rewarded him with a treat every single time he did the behavior initially because you really wanted him to learn that this was a behavior you wanted him to do. But once your dog sufficiently learned that trick, you probably didn't reward him every single time. Instead, you might have moved to a partial reinforcement schedule. On a partial reinforcement schedule, the behavior is rewarded sometimes, but not always. There are two main dimensions that we can use to classify partial reinforcement schedules. First, a partial reinforcement schedule could be either fixed or variable. In a fixed schedule, the timing of the reward is always the same and is thus predictable. In a variable schedule, it's not. Second, a partial reinforcement schedule could be based on either the number of responses, these are called ratio schedules, or it could be based on a duration of how long a behavior is being continuously performed, and these are called interval schedules. Crossing these two dimensions creates 4 different partial reinforcement schedules: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. Let's look now at an example of each one. First, a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement means that you are rewarded for performing a behavior every certain number of times. A store rewards promotion like this one, where buying 9 cups of coffee gets you an additional 10th cup for free, is an example of a fixed ratio schedule. The behavior that is trying to be reinforced, in this case buying coffee at that particular establishment, is rewarded with a free beverage every 9 times you complete the behavior. Thus, this is a ratio schedule because it's based on the number of times the behavior is completed, and the ratio is fixed. You know ahead of time that you need to buy coffee exactly 9 times in order to get your reward. In a variable ratio schedule, you are still rewarded based on the number of times you perform a desired behavior. However, because the schedule is now variable, the timing of that reward is no longer fixed or predictable. Instead, you might be rewarded for performing the behavior on average a given number of times, but you never know for certain exactly when a reward is coming. A slot machine is an example of a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. In this case, the desired behavior, well, at least from the casino's perspective, is you putting some money in the machine and playing the game. The slot machine is designed to pay out a certain number of times on average. However, there's no predicting exactly when a payout is coming. In theory, you could get a payout twice in a row, or you could play hundreds of games without a dime to show for it. Moving on to interval schedules. On a fixed interval schedule, you are rewarded based on performing the behavior for a certain length of time. And again, because the schedule is fixed, you know exactly how long you need to be performing that behavior in order to get the reward. An hourly wage employee is an example of a fixed interval schedule. The employee is paid a certain amount for every hour that she spends continuously working. The schedule is also fixed. The employee knows exactly when that reward is coming. You may have also used a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement on yourself if you've ever told yourself that for every hour you spend studying, you'll reward yourself with some kind of treat. Finally, a variable interval schedule is when you are rewarded for performing a behavior for a certain length of time on average, but like a variable ratio schedule, you never know exactly when that reward is coming. Phone notifications are an example of a variable interval schedule of reinforcement. Depending on how active you and your friends are on social media or text messaging, you might get a notification on your phone, say every 20 minutes or so on average. However, the timing of each notification is ultimately unpredictable. You might get a lot of notifications at once, or you could go a whole day without hearing from your friends. Different reinforcement schedules come with different advantages and disadvantages. In terms of simple behavioral output, variable ratio schedules tend to produce the highest amount of responses, while fixed interval schedules tend to produce the lowest, as you can see here in this graph. Additionally, it's no coincidence that the 2 examples of variable schedules that I mentioned, gambling and checking notifications on your phone, are potentially addictive behaviors. This is because on a variable schedule, whether ratio or interval, people never know for sure when that reward is coming, and this incentivizes the person to keep doing that behavior because, well, you never know. A reward might be coming just around the corner. In this video, we covered the basics of operant conditioning. For the exam, you should be able to explain Thorndike's law of effect, Define positive and negative reinforcement and punishment and identify each in an example. Define fixed ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval schedules of reinforcement and identify each of those in an example as well.